Welcome back. You're watching View from the Top, and we are speaking to Managing Director of Transparency International, Cobus de Swardt, and he's also joined by Marius, who's Director of Risk Advisory Division at Deloitte. A very warm welcome to you, gentlemen. When we left, I was saying this is very interesting, but more than that, I think a very important discussion. And what I would like to talk about now is about public involvement. We have touched on that, but one of the important, I think, examples that you gave of what happened with Ugandan schools and just how that changed the level of corruption in the education system. Do give us again, I mean, our viewers weren't there when you were telling me about this, but do tell us what happened in Uganda.
In the mid-1990s, 1996, there's work done on the education sector in Uganda, and it was found that at a great portion of schools, only 10% of what was allocated in the national budget to go to those schools arrived finally at the school. So as well as administration cost, wastage in the system, etc. The Ugandan government tackled it. They did a few things. They increased financial controls, they brought more management efficiency in the system, and very brilliantly, they published at the local schools the amount allocated in a national budget to go to that school. 3 years later, same survey was done, more than 90% of the money arrived at the school. Because the basic things of getting the financial controls up, ensuring that there's more efficiency in the system, and just allowing parents to go and say, if we should get $100, why do we only get 10? And I think this is the magic of fighting corruption. That in the same way that you can go on a downward spiral, you can also go on an upward spiral, where if you empower people to participate, those gains that society can make also are the gains of the ordinary citizen in the street. And I think that that is where our country has a lot of room to improve. Because whilst we have, by and large, not only good agencies in place and the laws and the processes, there's a reluctance of political leaders and top officials in particular to actually be much more open and transparent and use public accountability as a key tool to drive this change. And that, I think, is a weakness in South Africa at the moment.
I want to ask you, Marius, and you wanted to say something on the back of that.
I mentioned earlier on that Deloitte has this partnership with the Anti-Corruption Centre with Dr. Gavin Woods, and they did research, and the research showed that there are 5 human behaviour things that impact on corruption. The first one is there needs to be a financial need or a level of greed. The second one is that there's a lack of ethics. The third one is there's an opportunity. The fourth one is your chances of being caught is remote. And the fifth one is if you do get caught, the consequences of that are remote. Those are 5 areas that impact on that human behavior. And that helps us to make a decision in terms of where can we intervene. There's not a lot that we can do about somebody's greed, but we can do stuff around awareness, around ethics and what is right and what is wrong. We can do a lot in terms of making the opportunities less. We can do a lot in terms of making sure that those guys who do get involved in corruption get caught. And there's a lot that we can do in terms of society and these agencies and the prosecuting authority to make sure that those guys who do get caught suffer the consequences.
One of the things that I found, we were doing research on the BRICS countries and how corruption has come under the spotlight in those countries. And one of the issues that came up in Brazil was that people in Brazil felt that even if an official was caught with the hand in the cookie jar, just the penal system was, they would either get fired or they'd get suspended, but you wouldn't see criminal charges being pressed against these people. And that was an issue in Brazil. And I think that is not just Brazil. That can be said about a lot of countries where people would like to see that you don't just get a slap on the wrist, that there is more follow through. So let's just speak about that happening here in South Africa. You've mentioned those factors, but just when it comes to the penal system, if that would be able to help the problem.
It would, because it would go a long way in terms of, we spoke about the trust issue, it would go a long way in terms of re-establishing the trust in those public entities. So people see, they need to see things happening. You know, some of the stuff in one of the papers that was delivered a day or two ago, and I think Cobus also mentioned it, I mean, there's a direct correlation between people paying their taxes to the government, and high levels of trust. So there's a direct financial benefit for the country and for the bigger community if we can re-establish those levels of trust, because people then decide, well, I might as well contribute at all the different levels because I trust these guys who I give my money.
But is this to say, when you're talking about whether people not knowing whether it's right or wrong?
People get to a point where they, in terms of those 5 areas that I mentioned earlier on, they get to a point where they justify why they are doing certain things. So it gets to a basic thing that somebody works in an environment, they did not get the increase or the promotion. They would get to a mental state where they say that I may accept this because I'm actually entitled to this because I didn't get the increase. So people would know, for example, that something is illegal, but they would not necessarily mentally agree that it's morally wrong. And that's the area where awareness can sort out these things, in terms of making sure that people understand that you cannot go into this vicious cycle of trying to justify it. People need to be aware of these things.
We often have, in conversations with companies, the whole issue of extortion and how can you, get to what's right and wrong. Given that we're an NGO, we usually give them simple answers. So say, well, it's very simple. If you say to somebody, you're extorted, you're asked for a bribe, and you say that's fine. In terms of our company policy, this will be published. You very quickly probably deal with 95% of bribes. So very simple. On the BRICS, I want to go back quickly because Brazil is a very interesting case. In the last year, the president fired 7 ministers because of corruption. The head of the Brazilian organizing committee for the World Cup in football resigned a few weeks ago. Again, precious. So what Brazil has taken on, and the president in particular, saying, I'm going to set the example at the top. 2 of those ministers are prosecuted at the moment. And I think those are important signals. However, we have also seen that that is not sufficient. You need to have more than just prosecuting people, because it can easily be seen as a witch hunt against your opponents. That has to be matched by a total openness from those in political power and senior officials in terms of their incomes. The whole issue of management of conflict of interest are done so poorly. If you think about Hannah, if you in our beautiful country were to ask all senior public officials, politicians, all members of parliaments to have in the public domain, updated whenever it changes, statements of interest that they hold, I think our country will look very different in a few years' time. It is the lack of doing the basics right that often are at the root cause. We saw when Ban Ki-moon became UN General Secretary, he made an asset declaration. We welcomed it. We were really wanted to say to him, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, would you please also do it when you leave office and every year after? Because that is where politicians and others often scheme off the system. And for that, just putting it in the public domain will arguably have a dramatic impact on what people are willing to do, and how going from rags to riches will not be built on public funds, but will be because of people being truly entrepreneurial. However, we see in particularly developing countries, the rags to riches stories are very often, far too often, linked of people digging into the public purse for their private gain.
John, I want to ask you very quickly, we've run out of time, but I need you to answer this for me very quickly. We have seen China come out and say, if we do not deal with corruption in this country, as huge as the economy is, as huge as people want to go into China, there is threat to the ruling party if they don't do something about the corruption levels in that country. What was the turnaround there?
Very simple. 3-4 years ago, China said, we'll start to deal with corruption inside the country. It might affect our economic growth a bit. What really put them over the top tipping point, the Chinese government, was when their own economic research started to clearly show that corruption, both in China as well as their companies abroad, was actually threatening their economic growth in such a substantial way that they said, and the president went public last year with the celebrations of the 90th anniversary of the party, saying this is the biggest threat to the party and the economic growth of the country. So it's a very economic, rational decision. And to that, I think there's a realization in China as well that you cannot, when your economy is booming, rely on people to be ethical and operate in the country and the country's best interests one part of the day, and another part of the day do illegal and shady deals. It's very simple. I cannot teach my children, you can steal from that shop, but don't steal from that shop. Ethical behavior. We are whole human beings. And I think China realizes it's not only the economic case, but the case of values and ethics actually matters as well.
And it goes back to what you were saying, corruption is not just a theft of resources, it's a theft of values. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm Hannah Viviers. Have a good evening. You were watching View from the Top.